Sometimes the most precious inheritances come in humble forms. When 8-year-old Lila lost her great-grandmother, she inherited only a rusty iron key, a sick dog named Butter, and a note, "Go to the house, trust your feet." Most would call that cruel, leaving a grieving child with practically nothing. But Lila followed those words, walking until her feet brought her to a forgotten mansion at town's edge. That old key fit perfectly into the heavy door, unlocking not just a house, but a family legacy deliberately buried for generations. Inside those dusty rooms lay proof of stolen land, hidden wealth and history that powerful people worked to erase. Could one little girl and her companion reclaim what was rightfully theirs? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning after great-grandmother Essie's funeral, Lila sat on the porch steps of the Patterson house, holding a yellowed piece of paper between her small fingers. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, each letter formed with the precision of someone who understood that words carried weight. "Go to the house. Trust your feet." Below the message, in the same measured script, was simply, "Love, great-grandmama, Essie." Mrs. Patterson had been bustling around the kitchen since dawn, her way of managing grief through motion and purpose. She was a kind woman, sturdy and practical, who had opened her home to foster children for more years than most folks could remember. But even her generous heart felt the particular heaviness that surrounded 8-year-old Lila, a child who had already weathered more loss than many adults would face in a lifetime. Lila's parents had died in a car accident 3 winters ago, when she was barely 5. The memories of them had begun to fade around the edges, like photographs left too long in sunlight. She remembered her mother's laugh, warm and sudden like summer rain, and her father's strong hands lifting her high above his head. But mostly, she remembered the silence that followed their absence, a hollow quiet that had settled over her world and never quite lifted. After the accident, Lila had been placed with relatives who quickly discovered that raising a grieving child required more patience than they possessed. She moved from house to house, carrying her few belongings in a worn duffel bag, until she finally landed with Mrs. Patterson. That was 18 months ago, and it was the longest she had stayed anywhere since her parents died. Great-grandmother Essie had been the one constant in those shifting years. Every few months, the elderly woman would appear at whatever home Lila was staying in, arriving by bus or in borrowed cars, always carrying a small paper sack of peppermint candies and stories that seemed to stretch back to the beginning of time. Essie was her father's grandmother, a tiny woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and eyes that held depths Lila was only beginning to understand. During those visits, Essie would sit with Lila on porches or in living rooms, speaking, in the slow, measured way of someone who had learned to choose words carefully. She told stories about ancestors Lila had never heard of, people with names like Jeremiah and Rosetta and Samuel, who had owned land and businesses, who had built something meaningful from nothing. But when Lila asked about these relatives, about their houses and their lives, Essie would grow quiet, her gaze drifting to some distant point beyond the windows. "Some stories have to wait for the right time to be told," Essie would say, patting Lila's hand with fingers that felt like paper and patience. "Some truths need the right ears to hear them." Lila never fully understood what her great-grandmother meant, but she treasured those visits. Essie was the bridge between her current uncertain world and something older, something that belonged to her in a way that foster homes never would. When Essie died peacefully in her sleep at the county nursing home, Lila felt that bridge collapse, leaving her more alone than ever. The funeral had been small, just Lila, Mrs. Patterson, and a handful of elderly folks from the nursing home who had known Essie. The service was held at Mount Olive Baptist Church, a small building with white clapboard siding that sat at the edge of Millbrook, the railroad town where Essie had lived most of her adult life. The preacher, Reverend Thomas, spoke about Essie's quiet faith and her gentle way with people, but Lila could tell he hadn't known her great-grandmother well. The words felt polite but distant, like describing a stranger. After the service, they had gathered in the church basement for a simple meal of fried chicken and potato salad. That's when Mr. Jameson, the lawyer, had approached Lila with a manila envelope. He was a nervous man with thinning hair who kept adjusting his glasses as he spoke. "Your great-grandmother left specific instructions," he had said, glancing uncertainly at Mrs. Patterson. "She wanted these items to go directly to you, Lila, no one else." The will had been brief, almost insultingly simple. No money. Essie had died with $37 to her name and a pile of medical bills. No property. She had been renting a small room at the nursing home. No family heirlooms of obvious value. Just three things: a rusty iron key that looked like it might have opened doors in another century, a note with its cryptic message, and guardianship of an old dog named Butter. Butter was currently lying in the shade beside the porch steps, his, breathing labored and uneven. He was a mixed breed of uncertain heritage, with golden fur that had gone grey around his muzzle and eyes that held the cloudy film of advancing age. The veterinarian had said he had maybe 6 months left, possibly less. His heart was failing, and the medications that might help cost more money than anyone expected an orphaned child to have. Mrs. Patterson had agreed to take the dog temporarily, but Lila could see the worry in her expression. Mrs. Patterson, already, stretched every dollar to care for the children in her home. Adding an elderly, sick dog to that burden wasn't sustainable for long. The unspoken understanding hung between them. If Lila couldn't find another solution soon, Butter would have to be put down. Lila folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket, then looked down at the key in her palm. It was heavier than it appeared, made of iron that had darkened with age and handling. The metal was worn smooth in places where fingers had gripped it over the years, and intricate designs were still visible around the head of the key. Flowers and vines that spoke of craftsmanship from an earlier era. "What house, do you think she meant?" Mrs. Patterson asked, settling down on the steps beside Lila. She had brought 2 glasses of sweet tea, condensation beading on the sides in the humid morning air. Lila shrugged, but her mind was already working. During their visits, Essie had sometimes mentioned the house in passing, never with explanation, but always with a particular tone, as if it were a place of significance. Once, when Lila was 6 and staying with a relative in the next county, Essie had arrived for a visit looking unusually tired. "I went by the house today," she had said to Lila's temporary guardian, almost as an afterthought. Still standing, still waiting, when Lila had asked what house she meant, Essie had smiled and changed the subject. But Lila remembered the way her great-grandmother's eyes had softened when she said it, as if the house were more than just a building, as if it were hope itself. "Mrs. Patterson," Lila said slowly, "can we drive around town today, just to look?" Mrs. Patterson studied the child's face, seeing determination there that hadn't been present since before Essie's death. She nodded. "I suppose we could do that. But Lila, honey, you understand that even if we find this house your great-grandmother mentioned, it might not—" "I know," Lila interrupted gently, "but she said to trust my feet. Maybe that means I'll know it when I see it." Butter lifted his head at the sound of their voices, his tail making a weak attempt at wagging. Despite his failing health, he had stayed close to Lila since arriving at the Patterson house, as if understanding that they were bound together by more than circumstance. Essie had raised him from a puppy, and in his canine way he seemed to grasp that Lila was his final link to the woman who had loved them both. Mrs. Patterson reached over and scratched behind Butter's ears, her expression thoughtful. She had seen many children pass through her home over the years, and she had learned to recognize when grief was beginning to transform into something else, sometimes bitterness, sometimes resignation, but occasionally something stronger in need. Lila's case, she sensed the emergence of purpose, fragile but genuine. "All right then," Mrs. Patterson said, standing and brushing off her dress. "Let me get my purse and keys. We'll take a drive and see what we can see." As they prepared to leave, Lila slipped the iron key into her pocket beside the note. The weight of it against her leg felt substantial, important. For the first time since Essie's death, she felt the stirring of something that might have been hope. Millbrook was the kind of town where 3 generations might live their entire lives without seeing much change. The railroad had built it in the 1880s, bringing prosperity for a few decades before freight routes shifted and the station became little more than a stop for the occasional passenger train. What remained was a collection of modest houses, a small downtown district with more empty storefronts than occupied ones, and the kind of quiet that settled over places where young people moved away and older folks stayed put. Mrs. Patterson drove slowly through the residential streets while Lila pressed her face to the passenger window. Butter lay across the back seat, occasionally lifting his head to look out at the passing scenery. They saw houses of every description, neat bungalows with flower gardens, larger Victorian homes that had seen better days, and small cottages that seemed to huddle close to the street as if seeking warmth from passing traffic. But none of them called to Lila the way the note suggested they should. None of them felt like the house that had lived in Essie's memory with such particular reverence. They were about to turn back toward Mrs. Patterson's neighborhood when Lila suddenly said, "Wait, can we go toward the edge of town? Past the old depot?" Mrs. Patterson glanced at her curiously but obliged, turning the car toward the less developed area where Millbrook faded gradually into farmland and forest. The houses here were fewer and farther apart, some abandoned, others maintained by families who valued privacy over convenience. As they drove past a stand of oak trees that had probably been standing since before the town existed, Lila felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that came from somewhere deeper than memory. Around the next curve, set back from the road on a rise of land that commanded a view of the surrounding countryside, stood a house that took her breath away. It was larger than the other homes they had seen, built in the style of the late 1800s. With a wraparound porch and tall windows that reflected the afternoon sky. The paint was faded and peeling, and the yard was overgrown with the kind of wild beauty that comes when nature begins to reclaim what humans have temporarily abandoned. But the bones of the house were solid, the lines graceful and welcoming. "Stop," Lila whispered, and Mrs. Patterson pulled the car to the side of the road. They sat in silence, looking up at the house through the windshield. It seemed both familiar and mysterious, like a face half-remembered from a dream. Butter had risen in the back seat and was whining softly, his attention fixed on the house with an intensity that seemed to match Lila's own. "Do you think—" Mrs. Patterson began, but Lila was already reaching for the door handle. "I need to see if the key fits," Lila said simply, and something in her voice made Mrs. Patterson nod and turn off the engine. Together, with Butter moving slowly beside them, they walked up the overgrown path toward the house that might hold the answers to questions Lila was only beginning to know how to ask. The front porch of the house creaked under their feet, the sound echoing across the quiet countryside like a greeting from the past. Lila approached the heavy wooden door with its panels of frosted glass, her heart beating so loudly she was certain Mrs. Patterson could hear it. The door handle was old-fashioned brass, tarnished green in places but still solid beneath her small hand. She pulled the rusty iron key from her pocket, and for a moment doubt crept in. What if this wasn't the right house? What if the key didn't fit, and this strange pull she felt was just the desperate hoping of a grieving child? But then Butter pressed against her legs, his warm weight grounding her, and she remembered Essie's words, "Trust your feet." The key slid into the lock, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The mechanism turned with surprising smoothness, and the door swung open with barely a whisper of hinges. Mrs. Patterson gasped softly behind her, but Lila stepped forward into the entrance hall, drawn by something she couldn't name. The interior took her breath away. Where she had expected dust and decay, she found a home that seemed suspended in time rather than abandoned. The hardwood floors gleamed with recent care, and though the furniture was covered with white sheets, everything spoke of deliberate preservation rather than neglect. Late afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like tiny spirits in the golden air. "Someone's been taking care of this place," Mrs. Patterson murmured, her voice filled with wonder. She pulled back one of the sheets to reveal a burgundy velvet sofa that looked as if it had been waiting for company to arrive. Butter moved through the rooms with purpose, his failing legs carrying him with more energy than he had shown in weeks. He seemed to know the layout of the house, pausing at doorways and sniffing corners with the familiarity of old memory. Watching him, Lila felt a strange certainty that this dog had been here before, perhaps many times. They moved through the house room by room, each space revealing new mysteries. The dining room held a massive oak table surrounded by 8 chairs, their seats upholstered in fabric that spoke of quality and care. The kitchen, though clearly from an earlier era, was spotless and organized, with copper pots hanging from hooks and a wood-burning stove that looked well-maintained. But it was in the front parlor that Lila found the first piece of the puzzle she didn't know she was solving. On the mantelpiece, beneath a protective covering of glass, sat a photograph in an ornate silver frame. She lifted the glass carefully and picked up the photograph, her breath catching as she recognized the face looking back at her. It was Essie, but an Essie decades younger than the woman Lila had known. In the photograph, her great-grandmother stood beside a tall, distinguished man in front of this very house. Essie wore a dress of pale blue silk, and her smile was radiant with a happiness that seemed to illuminate the sepia tones of the old image. The man beside her had kind eyes and strong hands, one of which rested protectively on Essie's shoulder. "Mrs. Patterson," Lila called softly, and the older woman hurried to join her. "My goodness," Mrs. Patterson breathed, taking the photograph. And from Lila's hands, "That's your great-grandmother, isn't it? But she looks so happy," Lila finished, "and young, and like she belonged here." Mrs. Patterson turned the frame over, and they found an inscription on the back, written in the same careful script as the note: "Essie and Samuel Caldwell, 1952, home at last." "Caldwell," Lila repeated, testing the name. She had never heard it before, but it felt right on her tongue, like a word she had been waiting her whole life to say. They continued exploring, and each room revealed new evidence of a life deliberately preserved. In what had clearly been a study, they found shelves lined with books and a desk where papers were arranged with meticulous care. Mrs. Patterson approached the desk while Lila was drawn to a large bookshelf that covered most of one wall. "Lila," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice strange and tight, "I think you need to see this." On the desk, spread out as if someone had been reviewing them recently, were documents that made no sense to Lila's 8-year-old understanding, but clearly meant something significant to Mrs. Patterson. There were official-looking papers with red seals, surveys and maps, and what appeared to be legal documents dating back many decades. Mrs. Patterson picked up one of the papers with trembling hands. "This is a deed," she said slowly, "from 1889. It shows ownership of this property and quite a bit of land around it, granted to Jeremiah Caldwell." She looked at Lila with wide eyes. "That would be your great-great-grandfather, wouldn't it?" Lila nodded, remembering Essie's stories about ancestors with names that sounded like history itself. But as Mrs. Patterson continued reading through the documents, her expression grew more puzzled and troubled. "According to this," she said, setting down one paper and picking up another, "the Caldwell family owned not just this house and the surrounding farmland, but substantial property in downtown Millbrook. Businesses, too. There are receipts here. For a general store, a grain elevator, even shares in the railroad itself. But that can't be right." Lila said. "Great-grandmama Essie was poor. She lived in that tiny room at the nursing home and never had money for anything." Mrs. Patterson was shaking her head, her expression grim. "There's something else here, a document from 1953. It looks like a forced sale. The entire Caldwell estate, sold for a fraction of its value to settle what it calls tax liens and outstanding on debts." She looked up at Lila. "But honey, there are other papers here that suggest those debts weren't real. This looks like—" She stopped herself, clearly uncertain how much of this complicated adult reality to share with a child. But Lila was already beginning to understand, in the way that children sometimes grasp emotional truths, even when the details elude them. "Someone took it away from them," Lila said simply. "Someone stole our house." Mrs. Patterson's silence was answer enough. They spent the next hour exploring the rest of the house, and everywhere they looked they found evidence of a family legacy that had been deliberately erased from public memory. In a cedar chest, they discovered quilts and linens, embroidered with E.C. Essie Caldwell. In a wardrobe, they found men's clothing that had been carefully preserved, along with photographs showing the same distinguished man from the parlor picture wearing those very suits. But perhaps most mysterious of all was the condition of the house itself. Despite being officially abandoned for decades, everything was clean, maintained, and carefully preserved. Someone had been caring for this place, keeping it ready for a homecoming that had taken 70 years to arrive. As the sun began to set, painting the rooms in shades of gold and amber, Lila found herself standing in what had clearly been a child's bedroom. A small bed with a handmade quilt sat beneath a window that looked out over the countryside. On a shelf, she discovered a collection of books and toys that seemed to have been waiting for a child's hands to bring them back to life. In the bottom drawer of a small dresser, wrapped in tissue paper, she found a rag doll with yarn hair and a dress made from the same fabric as one of the quilts downstairs. Pinned to the doll's dress was a note in Essie's familiar handwriting, "For the little girl who comes home." Lila held the doll against her chest and felt something fundamental shift inside her. This wasn't just a house she had inherited. It was a homecoming that had been planned before she was born. Essie had known somehow that Lila would find her. Way here, had prepared for it, had waited for it. But as the shadows lengthened and the first evening stars appeared in the darkening sky, Lila also sensed that this discovery was only the beginning. The papers on the desk downstairs, the evidence of stolen property and forced sales, the careful preservation of a home that should have fallen into ruin, all of it suggested a story much larger and more complicated than a simple inheritance. Mrs. Patterson appeared in the doorway, her expression troubled. "Lila, we need to talk about what we found here. This is more than just a house. There are legal implications, property rights, family history that someone's been taking care of this place," Lila interrupted, clutching the doll tighter. "Someone's been waiting for us to come home." "Yes," Mrs. Patterson agreed, "but who and why? And what does it mean for you now?" Outside, Butter's bark broke the evening quiet. Not his usual tired whine, but an alert, welcoming sound that suggested someone was approaching the house. Through the bedroom window, Lila could see headlights winding up the long driveway. "We're about to find out," she said, and despite the uncertainty that lay ahead, she felt no fear. She was standing in a room that had been prepared for her arrival, holding a doll that had waited decades for her touch, in a house that had never stopped being home. The rusty key that had opened the front door felt warm in her pocket, as if it had absorbed the heat of secrets finally revealed. But Lila was beginning to understand that this key had unlocked more than just a building. It had opened a door to a past that demanded to be acknowledged and a future that was hers to claim. Whatever came next, whoever was arriving in that car. Winding up the darkening driveway, Lila knew she was exactly where she belonged. For the first time since her parents' death, she was home. The car in the driveway belonged to Mr. Coleman, a neighbor whose farm bordered the Caldwell property. He was a man in his 70s with silver hair and the weathered hands of someone who had spent his life working the soil. As he climbed the front porch steps, his expression mixed curiosity with something that might have been recognition. "Saw the lights on," he said to Mrs. Patterson, removing his worn baseball cap. "Hadn't seen this place lit up in more years than I care to count. You folks the new owners?" Mrs. Patterson glanced at Lila, then back at Mr. Coleman. "This is Lila. She inherited the property from her great-grandmother, Essie." Mr. Coleman's weathered face went very still. He looked at Lila with sudden intensity, studying her features as if searching for something familiar. "Essie," he repeated slowly. "Little. Essie Caldwell. Well, I'll be." "You knew her?" Lila asked, stepping closer. Butter had positioned himself at her side, his tail wagging weakly but his eyes alert. "Knew her? Child, I grew up with Essie. Our families were neighbors for decades before—" He stopped himself, glancing again at Mrs. Patterson. "Before things changed around here. Haven't seen hide nor hair of her since she left this place. Must have been 1953, maybe 54. She never left," Lila said quietly. "She just couldn't come back home." Mr. Coleman's eyes softened with understanding that went deeper than words. He nodded slowly, as if pieces of a long puzzle were finally clicking into place. "May I come in? I think there are some things you ought to know about this place, about your family." They settled in the front parlor, where Mrs. Patterson had uncovered more of the furniture. Mr. Coleman looked around the room with the expression of a man seeing ghosts, but gentle ones that brought more comfort than sorrow. "This house was the pride of the county back in the day," he began, his voice taking on the rhythm of remembered history. "Your great-great-grandfather, Jeremiah, built it in 1889 when the railroad came through. The Caldwells owned more land than anyone else in 3 counties. Good farmland, timber, and they had businesses in town too." Lila had discovered a leather-bound photograph album on a side table, and she pulled it into her lap as Mr. Coleman spoke. The first page showed the house as it must have looked in its prime, painted white with green shutters, surrounded by manicured gardens and split-rail fences that stretched to the horizon. Jeremiah and his wife Ruth had 5 children, Mr. Coleman continued, "including your great-grandfather Samuel. When Jeremiah died in 1920, Samuel inherited everything and married your great-grandmother Essie in 1951. She was the prettiest girl in 4 counties and smart as a whip too. They were planning to modernize the farm, maybe start a cattle operation." Lila turned the page and found herself looking at photographs that took her breath away. Here was Essie in her 20s, radiant in a wedding dress as she stood next to Samuel on the front porch of this very house. There were pictures of family gatherings, church socials, harvest celebrations. In every image, the Caldwells appeared prosperous and respected, surrounded by friends and community. "What happened?" Mrs. Patterson asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. Mr. Coleman's expression darkened. "Same thing. That happened to a lot of successful black families in those days. There were folks in town who didn't appreciate the Caldwell's success. When Samuel inherited, certain people decided that the family was getting too big for their britches. Someone wanted their land," Lila said, understanding flooding through her, as she looked at picture after picture of a family that had clearly been wealthy and well-established. "Wanted it and took it," Mr. Coleman confirmed grimly. "They used—" The tax assessor's office claimed the Caldwells owed back taxes they didn't actually owe. When Samuel tried to fight it in court, they found other charges, said he'd been selling liquor without a license, claimed there were irregularities in his business dealings. All lies, but lies that stuck in those days if you had the wrong color skin and too much success. Lila continued turning pages in the album, watching her family's prosperity documented in careful detail. There were photographs of the general store her family had owned on Main Street, the grain elevator that bore the Caldwell name, even pictures of Samuel in a fine suit standing next to a new automobile. In one image, she found Samuel and Essie with a group of other well-dressed black families at what appeared to be a community celebration. There were others, she said, pointing to the photograph. Other families like ours. Oh yes, Mr. Coleman nodded. The Caldwells weren't the only ones. The Johnsons owned the sawmill, the Washingtons had the biggest dairy operation in the county, the Greens ran the best restaurant this side of Atlanta. But one by one they all got squeezed out. False charges, impossible tax bills, banks calling, in loans that weren't due. By 1955, most of the successful black families in the county were gone. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward, her expression troubled. And no one stopped it? Some tried, Mr. Coleman said sadly, but it was a different time. The folks doing the squeezing had the law on their side, or at least they had the people who interpreted the law. The rest of us, we were scared. We had our own farms and families to protect. Lila found a photograph near the back of the album that made her pause. It showed this very parlor, but filled with people. Samuel and Essie sat on the sofa where she was now sitting, surrounded by children and elderly relatives. Everyone was dressed in their finest clothes, and the atmosphere was clearly one of celebration. Christmas 1952, Mr. Coleman said, noticing her attention. That was the last big family gathering before everything fell apart. I remember because my mother made apple pies for the dinner, and Essie invited half the county. He smiled sadly. Your great-grandmother was like that, generous to a fault, always making sure everyone had enough. But she kept the house, Lila said, thinking of the preserved rooms and careful maintenance. Somehow she kept it. Mr. Coleman nodded. She was smarter than they gave her credit for. When the forces started closing in, she and Samuel made some legal arrangements, transferred the deed to relatives up north, set up trusts, moved assets around. On paper, they lost everything. But the house itself, well, let's just say it never actually left family hands, even if it looked like it did. Butter stirred beside Lila's chair, his breathing becoming more labored. The excitement of the day was taking its toll on his failing heart, and she could see the exhaustion in his cloudy eyes. She reached down to stroke his head, and he pressed against her hand with what little strength he had left. The dog remembers too, Mr. Coleman observed. Butter's been here before, hasn't he? Great-grandmama Essie raised him from a puppy, Lila said. But I don't understand how he could remember this place if she couldn't come back. Mr. Coleman exchanged a look with Mrs. Patterson. Child, there's a lot about your great-grandmother's life that might surprise you. Essie Caldwell was a woman who played a long game. She never stopped fighting for her family's legacy. She just fought it quiet-like, in ways that wouldn't draw the wrong kind of attention. As if to emphasize the point, Butter suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the staircase, his tail giving a weak wag. Following his gaze, Lila noticed something she had missed before, a small dog bed tucked discreetly in the corner of the room, as if someone had known that an old dog would need a comfortable place to rest. Someone's been taking care of this place, she said again, the certainty growing stronger. Someone's been keeping it ready. Yes, Mr. Coleman agreed, and I think it's time you met her. But first, you need to understand what you've inherited here isn't just a house and some land. You've inherited a responsibility to your family's memory and to the truth that's been buried for too long. He stood up, his old joints creaking with the effort. Mrs. Patterson, if you don't mind, I'd like to make a phone call. There's someone who's been waiting a very long time to meet this young lady. Someone who can tell her stories that even I don't know. As Mr. Coleman moved toward the old rotary phone in the hallway, Lila continued looking through the photograph album. Near the very end, she found a picture that made her heart skip. It showed a little girl, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, playing in the yard of this house with a small puppy that looked remarkably like Butter must have looked in his youth. On the back of the photograph, in Essie's careful handwriting, were the words, "Every ending is also a beginning." Lila closed the album and looked around the parlor. at the furniture her family had chosen, the windows they had looked through, the floors they had walked. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a homecoming that had been decades in the making, and she was beginning to understand that her arrival here was part of a plan much larger than she had imagined. Butter settled more comfortably in his makeshift bed, his eyes fixed on Lila with an expression that seemed almost like relief. He had brought her home, just as Essie had trusted him to do. Now the real work could begin. Mr. Coleman's voice carried from the hallway as he spoke quietly into the old rotary phone. Lila could hear fragments of his conversation. "She's here, and just like Essie said she would be, and you'd better come now." While they waited, Mrs. Patterson began examining the study more carefully, her trained eye taking in details that spoke of both wealth and careful planning. "Lila," she called softly, "come look at this." Mrs. Patterson had discovered something unusual about the wall behind Samuel's desk. What had appeared to be solid wood paneling was actually a concealed cabinet, and she had found the hidden latch purely by accident while examining a framed diploma. The panel swung open to reveal a narrow compartment filled with documents that had been protected from light and moisture for decades. "Railroad stocks," Mrs. Patterson breathed, carefully removing a portfolio bound in cracked leather. "Look at these, honey. These are shareholding certificates for the Carolina Northern Railroad, dated 1923 through 1951. Lila moved closer as Mrs. Patterson spread the certificates across the desk. Each document was elaborately decorated with ornate borders and official seals, and all bore the same name, Samuel Caldwell, shareholder. The numbers printed on each certificate meant nothing to Lila, but she could see from Mrs. Patterson's expression that they were significant. "How much?" Lila asked simply. Mrs. Patterson was adding figures in her head, her lips moving silently. "If these certificates are still valid, and I don't see any reason why they wouldn't be, your family owned nearly 15% of the railroad that built this entire region." She looked up at Lila with wide eyes. "That would be worth, well, it would be worth a great deal of money today." They were interrupted by the sound of car doors slamming in the driveway. Through the window, Lila could see that 2 vehicles had arrived. Mr. Coleman was walking toward them, but he wasn't alone. A tall man in an expensive suit was getting out of a black sedan, while an elderly black woman emerged from a smaller car, moving with the careful dignity of advanced age. "Dorothy Mills," Mr. Coleman called as he opened the front door. Come in. And Marcus, I wasn't expecting you quite so soon." The woman who entered first was thin and elegant, with silver hair pulled back in a neat chignon, and intelligent, eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She moved through the house as if she belonged there, her gaze taking in every detail, with the satisfaction of someone seeing a long-held plan come to fruition. The man behind her was younger, perhaps in his 40s, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He wore a crisp white shirt and gold cufflinks, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. When he saw Lila, his expression shifted from curiosity to calculation. "So you're the child," he said, his tone neither warm nor hostile. "I'm Marcus Caldwell. Samuel was my grandfather's brother, which makes us cousins of some sort." He glanced around the parlor with obvious appraisal. "I understand you've come into some property." Dorothy Mills shot Marcus a sharp look before approaching Lila with much gentler energy. "Hello, dear," she said, her voice carrying the soft authority of a retired teacher. "I'm Dorothy Mills. I was your great-grandmother's closest friend, and I've been taking care of this house for her since 1953. "You're the one," Lila said, understanding flooding through her. "You're the one who's been keeping everything ready." Dorothy smiled, and in that smile, Lila could see echoes of the warmth she remembered from Essie's visits. "Essie made me promise, child. She said someday the right person would come home. And when they did, this house needed to be ready for them." Marcus cleared his throat impatiently. "That's all very touching, but we need to discuss the legal realities here." If this child has inherited property that rightfully belongs to the Caldwell family, then other family members have claims that need to be considered. Mrs. Patterson stepped protectively closer to Lila. Essie's will was very clear. Everything goes to Lila? Yes, but did Essie actually own anything to leave? Marcus countered smoothly. According to public records, the Caldwell estate was sold for taxes in 1953. If someone has been maintaining this property illegally for 70 years, the property was never sold, Dorothy interrupted firmly. It was transferred legally and properly into trust. Essie and Samuel were smarter than the people trying to steal their land gave them credit for. She moved to the desk where the railroad certificates lay spread out, her expression growing. Satisfied as she saw what Mrs. Patterson had discovered. I see you've found some of Samuel's investments. That's only the beginning, child. Your great-grandmother spent 70 years making sure that what was stolen from your family would eventually be returned. Dorothy opened her purse and withdrew a manila folder that looked official and important. These are the real ownership documents, the trust papers that Samuel and Essie filed in 3 different states, making sure that no matter what happened, to them personally, this property would stay in the family until the right heir came to claim it. Marcus reached for the folder, but Dorothy held it away from him. These documents name Lila specifically as the beneficiary. Not other relatives, not distant cousins. Lila. Essie knew exactly what she was doing, as if sensing the tension in the room. Butter struggled to his feet and moved closer to Lila. His breathing was still labored, but there was something different about him now, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there since Essie's death. Dorothy noticed his movement and smiled. "Hello, old friend," she said softly, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "You brought her home, didn't you? Just like Essie said you would." Mr. Coleman, who had been listening quietly from the doorway, spoke up. "Dorothy, maybe you should tell them about the other properties." "Other properties?" Mrs. Patterson asked. Dorothy nodded, opening the folder and withdrawing a map that had been hand-drawn and carefully annotated. The house and immediate land were just the beginning. Over the years, Essie quietly reacquired parcels of the original Caldwell holdings, sometimes through intermediaries, sometimes through complicated legal arrangements, sometimes by simply paying property taxes on abandoned lots until she could claim them. She spread the map on the coffee table, and Lila could see red marks indicating dozens of properties scattered throughout the county. Some were farm parcels, others were vacant. Lots in town, and several appeared to be commercial buildings. "Your great-grandmother was playing a very long game," Dorothy explained. "Every time a piece of Caldwell land came up for sale or tax auction, she found a way to get it back. She worked 3 jobs for decades, saved every penny, and slowly rebuilt what had been stolen from her family." Marcus studied the map with growing agitation. "This can't all be legal. There are statutes of limitations, adverse possession laws." "All properly observed," Dorothy said calmly. "Essie didn't break any laws. She just used the same legal system that had been used against her family, only she was more patient and more careful than the people who originally stole the land." Lila looked down at Butter, who had settled at her feet but was watching the conversation with alert intelligence. "She planned all of this," she said slowly. "Even when I was little, when she visited me, she was planning for this day." "From the moment you were born," Dorothy confirmed. "Essie said you had the look of the Caldwells, the stubborn chin and the eyes that see everything. She said you'd be the one to finish what she started." "Finish what?" Mrs. Patterson asked. Dorothy's expression grew serious. "Making sure the truth about what happened to this family gets told. Making sure the people who stole from the Caldwells face consequences, even if it's 70 years late. And making sure that other families who lost everything the same way know they don't have to accept injustice as final." The room fell silent as the weight of that responsibility settled over them. Lila looked around at the house that had been preserved for her homecoming, at the documents that proved her family's stolen wealth, at the photographs that showed a prosperity deliberately erased from history. Marcus broke the silence. This is going to attract attention. Legal challenges, media coverage, people asking questions. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? The question, Dorothy said, looking directly at Lila, is whether you're ready to claim what's yours and fight for what's right. Because once this story gets out, and it will get out, everything is going to change. Lila thought of Essie's note. Trust your feet. Her feet had brought her home, but now they would have to carry her forward into a future that was both a gift and a responsibility. She looked down at Butter, whose tail thumped weakly against the floor, and made her decision. Great-grandmama Essie trusted me with this, she said quietly. I'm not going to let her down. Outside, the evening was growing darker, but inside the Caldwell house, lights burned in windows that had been dark for too long. The railroad certificates scattered across Samuel's desk seemed to glow in the lamplight, each one a promise that patient justice could indeed be served, even if it took generations to arrive. After Marcus left with promises to return with his own lawyer, Dorothy settled into the parlor with the comfortable ease of someone who belonged there. She had brought a worn leather satchel from her car, and as the evening deepened around them, she began removing bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. There's something else you need to understand about your inheritance, Dorothy said, untying the first bundle with careful fingers. Your great-grandmother and I, we wrote to each other every week for 70 years. These letters tell the real story of what happened to your family. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward with interest, while Lila curled up on the sofa beside Butter, who seemed more comfortable than he had been in weeks. The familiar surroundings appeared to be giving the old dog a second wind, and his breathing had grown less labored as the evening progressed. Dorothy selected a letter from 1953. The paper yellowed with age, but the ink still clear. This one was written 3 weeks after your great-grandparents were forced to leave this house, she said, then began to read in Essie's voice, which Dorothy seemed to carry in her memory. Dearest Dorothy, she read, Samuel and I are staying with his cousin in Detroit for now, but we won't be here long. The lawyers say there's nothing more we can do, but lawyers don't know everything. I've been thinking about what Papa always said, that patience is just another word for strategy. They think they've won, but this isn't over, not by a long shot. Dorothy looked up at Lila. Your great-grandmother never accepted what happened as final. From the very beginning, she was planning her return. She selected another letter, this one from 1955. Dorothy, I need you to do something for me. I'm sending money, not much, but what I can spare from my job at the factory. Use it to pay the property taxes on the house. I know it sounds crazy, since we don't officially own it anymore, but I have a feeling those taxes aren't being paid by the people who stole it from us. If we can keep paying them, maybe we can claim the property back someday. You've been paying the taxes all these years? Mrs. Patterson asked, amazement in her voice. Dorothy nodded. At first, just on this house and the immediate land. But as the years went on, and Essie started acquiring other properties, I became her local representative for everything. She'd send money, I'd handle the paperwork. We became partners in a very long game of chess. She pulled out a photograph that had been tucked between the letters, a picture of 2 young girls, perhaps 12 years old, standing in front of this very house. One was clearly Essie, and the other was Dorothy, though both looked impossibly young and hopeful. We grew up together, Dorothy explained. Our families were neighbors, and Essie was like the sister I never had. When everything fell apart for the Caldwells, I couldn't just stand by and watch, so I became what you might call the keeper of secrets. Lila studied the photograph, seeing in those young faces the beginning of a friendship that would span decades and survive displacement, poverty, and injustice. Why didn't great-grandmama Essie ever come back? Even just to visit? Dorothy's expression grew sad. She was afraid, child. Not of this place, but of the people who had forced her family out. Some of them were still alive, still in positions of power. She was worried that if she came back too soon, before everything was properly arranged, they might find ways to take it all away again. She selected another letter, this one from the 1970s. Dorothy, I've been thinking about the future, about what happens when I'm gone. I know we always planned that Samuel and I would come home together, but his heart isn't strong anymore, and I'm not sure he'll live to see our plans come to fruition. If something happens to us, I need you to promise me something. Wait for the right person. Wait for the child who carries the family forward. You'll know her when she comes. She'll have Samuel's stubborn chin and my grandmother Ruth's eyes. She'll come with butter, and she'll know this house is home even before she walks through the door. She was talking about me, Lila whispered, unconsciously touching her chin. She was talking about you, Dorothy confirmed. She described you perfectly, years before you were born. Essie had a gift for seeing the future, especially when it came to family. Mrs. Patterson was shaking her head in wonder. How could she possibly have known? Dorothy smiled mysteriously. Essie always said the Caldwell women had what her grandmother called the knowing, an ability to sense how things would unfold, especially when it came to matters of justice and family legacy. She trusted that intuition completely. She pulled out a more recent letter. This one dated just 2 years ago. Dorothy, my health is failing, but I'm not worried anymore. I've done everything I can to prepare the way. The child is 8 now, and I can see in her eyes that she's ready, even if she doesn't know it yet. When the time comes, help her understand that this inheritance isn't just about property or money. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it takes a lifetime to see justice done. As Dorothy read, Lila noticed that Butter had lifted his head and was looking toward the window. Following his gaze, she saw headlights moving slowly past the house, not turning into the driveway, but clearly someone driving by to get a look at the property. Word is already spreading, Dorothy observed, noticing the same thing. That's the 3rd car to drive by since Marcus left. People are curious about why there are lights on in the Caldwell house for the first time in 70 years. Is that bad? Lila asked. Dorothy considered the question carefully. Not bad necessarily, but complicated. This community has lived with certain assumptions for decades about your family, about what happened in the 1950s, about who the real victims were. When the truth comes out, some people are going to be very uncomfortable. She pulled out one final letter, this one written in a shakier hand that spoke of Essie's advancing age. Dorothy, I won't live to see the homecoming, but I'm not sad about that. I've done my part, and now it's time for the next generation to do theirs. The child will need guidance, but she'll also need the freedom to make her own choices about how to use what I'm leaving her. Don't let anyone, not lawyers, not distant relatives, not well-meaning adults, tell her that she's too young to understand the responsibility she's inheriting. The Caldwell women have always been old souls. She'll know what to do. Dorothy folded the letter carefully and looked at Lila with eyes that held decades of shared purpose. So the question is, child, what do you want to do? You could sell everything tomorrow and walk away with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life. Or you could honor your great-grandmother's larger vision and use this inheritance to continue the fight she started. Before Lila could answer, they heard vehicles approaching again. Not just one car this time, but several. Through the window, they could see trucks and SUVs turning into the driveway, their headlights creating a procession of light that suggested this wasn't just curious neighbors anymore. Looks like the family reunion is about to get bigger, Dorothy said dryly, but Lila could hear concern beneath her calm tone. Mrs. Patterson moved to the window and peered out at the approaching vehicles. That's a lot of people for this time of night. Should we be worried? Dorothy was already moving toward the hallway closet, where she retrieved something that made Mrs. Patterson's eyes widen, a shotgun that looked well-maintained and ready for use. Probably not, Dorothy said calmly, checking the weapon with practiced efficiency. But your great-grandmother didn't spend 70 years planning your homecoming just to have it disrupted by folks who think they can bully a child out of her. Inheritance. Lila looked down at Butter, who had risen to his feet with more energy than he'd shown in weeks. His ears were alert and his stance protective, as if he remembered not just this house, but also his role as guardian of the family that lived here. "We're not going anywhere," Lila said quietly, but with a firmness that would have made Essie proud. "This is our home." Outside, car doors were slamming and voices were rising in the kind of heated discussion that suggested the peaceful portion of the evening was about to end. But inside the Caldwell house, 3 generations of women stood ready to defend what had been fought for across decades of patience and planning. The letters scattered across the coffee table seemed to glow in the lamplight, each one a link in a chain of determination that stretched from Essie's forced exile to Lila's triumphant return. The real battle was about to begin. The group that assembled on the front porch was larger and more varied than Lila had expected. Marcus had returned, with 2 other men in expensive suits, lawyers, judging by their briefcases and predatory expressions. But there were also people who looked like relatives, including an elderly woman who shared Essie's high cheekbones and a middle-aged man whose eyes held the same stubborn glint Lila recognized from her own mirror. Dorothy opened the door with the shotgun resting casually in the crook of her arm, her message clear without words. "Evening," she said pleasantly. "Bit late for social calls, isn't it?" Marcus stepped forward, clearly appointed as the spokesman. "We need to discuss the situation. Here, there are legal complications that can't wait until morning." "The only complication I see," Dorothy replied evenly, "is a bunch of people showing up uninvited at a child's home after dark. But I suppose we can discuss things like civilized people. Come in, but wipe your feet and mind your manners." They filed into the parlor, which suddenly felt crowded with competing agendas. The elderly woman introduced herself as Claudia Caldwell, Samuel's niece, while the middle-aged man was revealed to be Robert Caldwell, a distant cousin from Chicago who had driven down immediately after Marcus called him. "We're not here to cause trouble," Claudia said, her voice gentler than the others. "But when family property is involved, family should have a say." One of the lawyers, a thin man with nervous energy, began pulling documents from his briefcase. "There are several issues that need immediate attention. First, the question of proper probate. Second, the validity of documents that haven't been seen by the court. Third, the tax implications of property that may have been illegally maintained." "Stop," Dorothy said firmly. "Before anyone starts throwing around legal threats, maybe you should see what you're actually dealing with." She moved to the bookshelf and withdrew a massive leather-bound Bible that Lila hadn't noticed before. It was clearly very old, with brass corners and a binding that spoke of both value and reverence. Dorothy placed it carefully on the coffee table, displacing some of the letters. "This has been in the Caldwell family since 1863, Dorothy said, opening the Bible to reveal pages filled with careful handwriting. Family births, deaths, marriages, all recorded here, including Lila's complete lineage, documented by Essie herself. But as Dorothy continued turning pages, Lila noticed something unusual about the Bible's construction. The binding seemed thicker than necessary, and there were subtle differences in the pages that suggested hidden compartments. Dorothy noticed her attention and smiled. "Essie wasn't the first Caldwell woman to plan for difficult times," she said, pressing a hidden catch that caused a section of the binding to spring open. "Her grandmother Ruth had some secrets of her own." From the concealed compartment, Dorothy withdrew documents that were even older than the railroad certificates, land grants dating back to Reconstruction, property deeds, and business licenses that told the story of a family that had been building wealth for generations before anyone tried to take it away. "Jeremiah Caldwell didn't just buy this land," Dorothy explained, spreading the documents across the table. "It was granted to him by the federal government in 1867 as part of the land redistribution after the Civil War. The Caldwells were among the few black families in this region who managed to hold on to their grants and build something substantial. Robert Caldwell leaned forward, his expression shifting from skepticism to interest as he examined the documents. These are original land grants. If they're authentic, Dorothy said dryly. And they establish that the Caldwell family's claim to this property goes back over 150 years, which makes what happened in the 1950s not just theft, but a violation of federal land grants. The nervous lawyer was making notes frantically, but his expression suggested he was calculating complications rather than solutions. This opens up significant legal questions. If these documents are valid, there could be implications for other properties in the area, other families who were displaced. Exactly, Dorothy said, her satisfaction evident. Essie didn't just want justice for her own family. She wanted to open the door for other families who had similar experiences. She opened another hidden compartment in the Bible and withdrew a folded map that, when opened, showed not just the local county but several surrounding regions. Red marks indicated properties across multiple states with dates and notations. In Essie's careful handwriting, your great-grandmother spent 70 years tracking down what happened to other black landowners who were forced out during the same period, Dorothy explained to Lila. She documented cases in Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, dozens of families who lost everything to the same kinds of fraudulent tax claims and legal manipulation. Claudia was studying the map with growing amazement. She was building a case, not just for our family, but for all of them. And she was acquiring documentation to prove it, Dorothy confirmed. Every time she could afford it, she would travel to county courthouses, historical societies, anywhere records might be kept. She built the most comprehensive documentation of systemic land theft in the Southeast that anyone has ever assembled. Marcus looked increasingly uncomfortable as the scope of Essie's work became clear. This is going to attract attention we might not want. Federal investigators, journalists, civil rights organizations. Good, Dorothy said firmly. It's past time this story was told. But as they talked, Lila noticed that Butter was struggling again. The excitement and stress of the evening were taking their toll on his failing heart, and his breathing had become labored once more. She knelt beside him, stroking his head as he panted. "He needs to see a veterinarian," Mrs. Patterson observed. "Tonight, if possible." "The emergency clinic in the county seat," Claudia suggested. "But that's going to be expensive. Heart medication for dogs." "Money isn't the problem," Robert interrupted, gesturing toward the documents spread across the table. "If even half of this is legitimate, this child has just inherited a fortune. But accessing that fortune is going to take time," the nervous lawyer pointed out. "Probate, authentication, legal challenges, these things don't happen overnight. In the meantime, I'll handle Butter's medical expenses," Dorothy said firmly. Essie left specific provisions for his care. She opened one final compartment in the Bible and withdrew something that made everyone in the room go silent. A stack of bank statements and certificates of deposit, all showing substantial balances and all bearing recent dates. "Your great-grandmother wasn't poor," Dorothy said to Lila gently. "She lived modestly because she was saving every penny for this day. She knew that when you came home, you'd need resources to fight the battles ahead." Marcus stared at the bank statements with obvious shock. "How much money are we talking about?" "Enough," Dorothy said simply. "Enough to restore this house, enough to pay for the best lawyers, enough to fund the kind of legal challenge that will ensure justice isn't just served for the Caldwells, but for every family that was cheated the same way." Lila looked around the room at all these adults arguing about money and legal strategies, then down at Butter, who was clearly suffering. The choice seemed obvious to her. "We're taking Butter to the vet," she announced, surprising everyone with the authority in her young voice. "Right now, and tomorrow we're going to start doing what great-grandmama Essie wanted us to do, which is..." Robert asked. Lila stood up, and for a moment she looked older than her 8 years, like a child who had inherited not just property, but purpose. We're going to make sure everyone knows the truth about what happened to our family. And we're going to help other families get their truth told, too. Outside, more cars were pulling into the driveway, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Word was clearly spreading fast, and Lila had the sense that this was only the beginning of a much larger story. But as she helped Butter to his feet and prepared to take him for the medical care he needed, she felt the weight of her great-grandmother's planning settling around her like a mantle. Essie had prepared for this moment for 70 years, and now it was time for the next generation to carry the work forward. The family Bible lay open on the coffee table, its hidden compartments finally revealed, its secrets ready to change not just Lila's life, but the lives of countless other families who had been waiting decades for someone to tell their story. Veterinary emergency clinic was 40 minutes away, and Butter rode in Mrs. Patterson's back seat with his head in Lila's lap, his breathing shallow but steady. Dorothy followed in her own car, and by the time they reached the clinic, she had made several phone calls that suggested this night was far from over. Dr. Martinez, the emergency veterinarian, was a kind woman with gentle hands who examined Butter with thorough care. His heart is definitely failing, she confirmed, but there are medications that can improve his quality of life significantly. The treatment isn't cheap, but if cost isn't an issue, Dorothy said firmly, pulling out a credit card that looked distinctly different from what someone of modest means might carry. Do whatever he needs. While Butter received IV fluids and heart medication, Dorothy sat with Lila in the waiting room and finally revealed the secret she had been keeping for decades. Your great-grandmother wasn't poor, child, Dorothy said quietly, glancing around, to make sure they couldn't be overheard. She was one of the wealthiest black women in the Southeast, but she spent 70 years making sure nobody knew it. Lila stared at her in confusion, but she lived in that tiny room at the nursing home. She never had money for anything nice. Dorothy smiled sadly. That was the performance of a lifetime. Essie knew that if people thought she had money, they'd find ways to take it away from her again, so she became invisible, a poor old woman with nothing worth stealing. From her purse, Dorothy withdrew something that made Lila gasp. It was another key, but this one was modern, made of polished metal with First National Bank engraved on a small plastic tag. This opens a safety deposit box that your great-grandmother has been adding to for 70 years, Dorothy explained. She didn't just save the money from her factory jobs and cleaning work. She invested it, grew it, multiplied it in ways that would have made Samuel proud. How much money are we talking about? Mrs. Patterson asked, though her voice suggested she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Enough to buy half the county, Dorothy said simply. Enough to fund legal challenges that could last decades. Enough to establish a foundation that could help hundreds of displaced families reclaim their stolen inheritance. But before Lila could fully process this revelation, Dorothy's phone rang. Her expression grew grim as she listened to the caller. We need to get back to the house, she said, hanging up. Now. The drive back to the Caldwell property was tense, and as they approached, Lila could see why Dorothy was worried. The driveway and road were now crowded with vehicles, not just the relatives who had been there earlier, but news vans, official-looking cars, and what appeared to be law enforcement. Word got out fast, Mrs. Patterson observed. Too fast, Dorothy agreed, her jaw set with determination. Someone made phone calls they shouldn't have made. They parked at the edge of the chaos and worked their way through the crowd toward the house. Lila could hear fragments of conversations that made her stomach clench with anxiety. Property worth. Millions hidden for decades. Child doesn't understand what she's inherited. Needs adult supervision for decisions this big. On the front porch, Marcus was holding court with a group of people who had the predatory look of those who smelled opportunity. When he saw Lila approaching, his expression shifted to something that might have been sympathy, but felt more like calculation. There you are, he said, stepping forward. We've been worried about you. This situation has gotten very complicated very quickly." "What kind of complicated?" Dorothy asked, her hand moving instinctively toward her purse, where Lila suspected the shotgun had been replaced by something equally protective. Media attention, legal challenges, questions about a miner's capacity to manage significant assets, Marcus explained smoothly. "The responsible thing might be to establish a conservatorship until Lila comes of age. For her own protection, of course." "Of course," Dorothy said dryly, "and I suppose you'd be willing to serve as conservator, out of family loyalty?" Before Marcus could answer, a new voice cut through the crowd. "Actually, that won't be necessary." The speaker was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and the kind of professional bearing that suggested both competence and authority. She wore a simple but expensive suit and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "I'm Sarah Chen," she said, approaching Lila directly rather than addressing the adults around her. "I'm an attorney, and I've been waiting a very long time to meet you." Dorothy's expression shifted from wariness to relief. "You're the lawyer Essie hired." "I'm the lawyer Essie hired 20 years ago to prepare for this exact situation," Sarah confirmed. "Ms. Dorothy Mills has been my local contact, but I've been managing your great-grandmother's legal affairs since you were born, Lila." She opened her briefcase and withdrew documents that looked far more official than anything Marcus's lawyers had produced. "Your great-grandmother anticipated that when the truth about her wealth became known, there would be people who would try to claim that an 8-year-old couldn't possibly manage such assets responsibly. And," Mrs. Patterson prompted, "and she established legal structures that protect Lila's inheritance while ensuring she has access to everything she needs," Sarah explained. "A foundation board that includes Dorothy, myself, and 3 other attorneys who have been preparing for this day for decades. Lila maintains complete control, but she has expert guidance available whenever she needs it." Marcus's face had gone pale as he realized his schemes were falling apart. "But surely the courts will want to review." "The courts reviewed everything when the trusts were established," Sarah interrupted calmly. "Everything your great-grandmother did was legal, documented, and designed to withstand exactly the kind of challenges we're seeing tonight." She turned back to Lila, her expression gentle but serious. "The question now is whether you want to proceed with your great-grandmother's plan. Because once we open that safety deposit box and the full extent of your inheritance becomes public knowledge, there's no going back to a quiet life." Lila looked around at the crowd of people, the media vehicles, the relatives who had appeared out of nowhere once money was involved. Then she thought about Essie, living modestly in a nursing home while sitting on a fortune, waiting patiently for 70 years for this moment. "What exactly was her plan?" Lila asked. Dorothy and Sarah exchanged a look, then Dorothy spoke. "To use the money and documentation she accumulated to file the largest land rights lawsuit in southeastern history, to force the federal government to acknowledge what was done to black landowners in the 1950s, and to provide restitution not just to your family, but to hundreds of other families who were cheated the same way." "She wanted to change history," Sarah added, "to make sure that what happened to your family could never happen to anyone else again." Lila thought about the photograph album, the letters, the careful documentation of injustice that Essie had assembled over decades. She thought about other children who might be out there separated from their family legacy by fraud and theft. "And the rusty key?" she asked, touching her pocket where it still rested. "Was always symbolic," Dorothy said, with a smile. "Your great-grandmother knew that the real key to everything would be your decision to come home and claim what was yours. The rusty key just got you through the front door." A reporter had somehow gotten close enough to overhear parts of their conversation, and Lila could see him scribbling notes frantically. By tomorrow, this story would be in newspapers across the region, and there would be no hiding anymore. "If I do this," Lila said slowly, "if I go ahead with great-grandmama Essie's plan, what happens to us? To me and Butter and Mrs. Patterson, you become the most famous 8-year-old in America, Sarah said honestly. You become the face of a legal challenge that could take years to resolve. You become a symbol of justice, delayed but not denied. But, Dorothy added, you also become the completion of your great-grandmother's life's work. You become the answer. To 70 years of patience and planning, you become hope for families who thought justice would never come. Lila looked down at the bank key in her hand, then up at the house where lights blazed in windows that had been dark for too long. Somewhere in that crowd, Butter was getting stronger on heart medication paid for by a fortune that had been hidden. In plain sight, somewhere in the future, other families were waiting for someone brave enough to fight for what was right. "When do we go to the bank?" she asked, and Dorothy smiled with the satisfaction of a woman who had kept a 70-year-old promise. The night air filled with the sound of car engines and urgent conversations as word spread that the quiet story of a child's inheritance had just become something much larger and more significant. But on the front porch of the Caldwell house, 3 generations of women stood ready to finish what Essie had started, no matter where it led them. The bank opened its doors at 9 o'clock, sharp on Monday morning, but by 8:30, a crowd had already gathered outside First National. News vans lined the street. Reporters clutched coffee cups and microphones, and what seemed like half the county had found reasons to be downtown that morning. Lila walked between Dorothy and Sarah Chen, her hand firmly clasped around the modern bank key that would unlock 70 years of carefully hidden planning. Mrs. Patterson followed close behind, while Butter, strengthened by his weekend of veterinary care, walked with more energy than he had shown in months. "Stay close to me," Sarah murmured as they approached the bank entrance. "Don't answer any questions from reporters. Whatever we find in that safety deposit box, we need time to process it before making any public statements." But as they reached the door, Marcus Caldwell stepped out from the crowd with 2 men in expensive suits. "I'm sorry, but we can't allow this to proceed," he announced loudly enough for the reporters to hear. "I've filed an emergency injunction claiming that this child is being manipulated by unscrupulous adults who want to exploit her inheritance." Sarah's expression didn't change, but Lila could feel the tension radiating from her. "Your injunction has no legal basis, Mr. Caldwell. The trusts were established legally, and Lila has every right to access what belongs to her." "Does she?" Marcus challenged. "Because I've done some research of my own. There are questions about the authenticity of some of these documents, questions about whether Essie Caldwell actually had the legal right to establish these trusts in the first place." A reporter thrust a microphone toward Lila. "How does it feel to be at the center of such a big legal battle?" Before Lila could answer, Dorothy stepped protectively in front of her. "The child will speak when she's ready. Right now, we have business to conduct." The bank manager, Mr. Wellington, appeared at the door, looking harried. "Perhaps we should conduct this privately," he suggested. "The safety deposit box area is secure, and we can avoid all this." He gestured helplessly at the circus surrounding them. But as they tried to enter the bank, another complication arose. A sheriff's deputy approached Sarah with official-looking papers. "Ma'am, I have a court order requiring that any assets discovered today be secured pending a full hearing on the matter of guardianship and property rights." Sarah examined the papers, her jaw tightening. "This is a fishing expedition. Judge Morrison had no authority to issue this order based on the flimsy evidence Mr. Caldwell presented. Nevertheless," the deputy said apologetically, "I'm required to ensure that nothing is removed from the bank without court supervision." Dorothy looked at the crowd, the reporters, the legal complications multiplying by the minute, and made a decision. "Lila," she said quietly, "your great-grandmother anticipated this too. We don't have to do this today." "Yes, we do," Lila replied with surprising firmness. "If we wait, there will just be more people trying to stop us. Great-grandmama Essie waited 70 years. I'm not waiting another day." She looked up at the bank manager. "Mr. Wellington, I'd like to access my safety deposit box, please. With witnesses present, if that's what the court order requires. 20 minutes later, they were gathered in the bank's secure area with the deputy, Mr. Wellington, Sarah, Dorothy, Mrs. Patterson, and, unfortunately, Marcus and his lawyers. The safety deposit box that corresponded to Lila's key was one of the largest the bank offered, and when Mr. Wellington opened it, everyone in the room drew in sharp breaths. The box was filled with documents, but also with something none of them had expected: rolled maps that looked far older than anything they had seen before. Dorothy carefully lifted out the first roll, and when she unrolled it on the examination table, they found themselves looking at a hand-drawn survey map of the county from 1889. "These are the original territorial survey maps," Mr. Wellington said in amazement. "I've never seen originals before. They're supposed to be in the state archives." "These are copies," Dorothy said, examining the fine print. "But official copies, certified by the territorial government." She pointed to various sections of the map. "Look at this. The original survey shows that the Caldwell family land grant included not just the house and farm, but nearly 3,000 acres extending all the way to what is now downtown Millbrook." Marcus leaned closer, his expression shifting from skepticism to alarm. "That can't be right. If that's accurate, it would mean that half the commercial district of Millbrook is built on land that was stolen from Lila's family." Sarah finished grimly. Dorothy unrolled a second map, this one from 1920, showing how the county had been divided into smaller parcels as the town grew. "Your great-grandmother traced every sale, every transfer, every suspicious transaction for 90 years, she told Lila. She documented exactly how the original Caldwell holdings were broken up and sold off, usually for taxes that weren't actually owed. But the maps were only the beginning. The safety deposit box contained portfolios of investment records showing that Essie had been quietly buying back pieces of the original family holdings for decades. What had appeared to be separate, unrelated properties were actually part of a systematic effort to reassemble the original land grant. "She owned the old courthouse," Mrs. Patterson said in amazement, reading through a deed, "and the railroad depot, and 3 blocks of Main Street." "How is that possible?" Marcus demanded. "If she owned all this property, why did she live like she was poor?" "Because she was playing a longer game than you could imagine," Dorothy replied. "Every dollar she earned went toward buying back what was stolen. She lived on practically nothing so that someday her great-granddaughter could reclaim everything." Sarah was examining financial documents with growing excitement. "These investment records show compound growth over decades. Conservative estimates suggest the portfolio value is somewhere around—" She stopped, double-checking her calculations. "Around what?" the deputy asked. "Around $40 million, Sarah said quietly. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Marcus's lawyer frantically scribbling notes. $40 million wasn't just a fortune. It was the kind of wealth that would attract attention from far beyond the local community. But as they continued examining the contents of the safety deposit box, they discovered that money was only part of Essie's legacy. There were letters from other families across the southeast who had lost property under similar circumstances, all carefully catalogued and cross-referenced. There were legal briefs prepared by civil rights attorneys dating back to the 1960s. There was documentation of a network of allies, historians, activists, lawyers, who had been quietly building a case for systematic restitution for decades. "She wasn't just planning to get your property back," Dorothy explained to Lila. "She was planning to change the entire legal framework around property rights and historical injustice." The deputy was looking increasingly uncomfortable as the scope of the discovery became clear. "I think I need to contact the judge," he said. "This is bigger than anyone anticipated." But before he could make his call, Mr. Wellington received a phone call that changed everything. After a brief, tense conversation, he hung up and addressed the room. That was the State Attorney General's office, he said. Apparently, word about today's discovery has reached the capital. They're sending investigators to examine the documents. What kind of investigators? Sarah asked sharply. The kind that look into potential federal crimes, Mr. Wellington replied. If these maps and documents prove systematic property theft involving government officials, this becomes a federal case. Marcus had gone pale. Federal case? But this is just a family dispute over millions of dollars in stolen property and decades of documentary evidence of civil rights violations, Sarah interrupted. Your great-grandmother didn't just document what happened to your family. Lila, she documented a pattern of systematic theft that could implicate dozens of officials, judges, and business leaders. Dorothy was carefully rolling up the maps, her expression grim. Which means there are going to be a lot of powerful people who don't want this story to come out. As if to emphasize the point, Mr. Wellington's phone rang again. This time, when he hung up, his expression was troubled. That was the mayor's office. And before that, a call from someone claiming to represent various downtown business owners. It seems word is spreading fast, and not everyone is happy about these revelations. Lila looked around the room at all the adults whose lives were about to be turned upside down by her great-grandmother's 70-year plan. Then she looked down at Butter, who had been quietly observing the proceedings from beside her chair. His eyes were clearer than they had been in weeks, and his tail thumped against the floor with what might have been approval. What happens next? She asked. Sarah gathered the most important documents into her briefcase. Next, we prepare for the fight of our lives. Because once these documents become public, everyone who has been benefiting from the status quo is going to try to stop us. But we have the law on our side, Mrs. Patterson protested. We have justice on our side, Dorothy corrected. The law is what we're going to have to fight to change. As they prepared to leave the bank, Lila noticed that the crowd outside had grown larger and more agitated. She could see protesters with signs, counter-protesters with different signs, and what appeared to be more law enforcement than a small town usually saw in a month. Dorothy, she said quietly, what would great-grandmama Essie want me to do now? Dorothy smiled, but it was a smile tinged with sadness and determination. She'd want you to remember that justice delayed isn't justice denied, as long as someone is willing to keep fighting for it. She'd want you to be brave enough to finish what she started, no matter how many people try to stop you. And if I'm not brave enough, Lila asked, then you wouldn't be here, Dorothy replied simply. Essie knew exactly who you were going to be long before you knew it yourself. She trusted you with this for a reason. Outside, the crowd was growing restless, and Lila could see news vans from stations she didn't recognize. Apparently, this story was reaching beyond the local community. As they prepared to face whatever came next, she touched the original rusty key in her pocket, the one that had started this journey. Tomorrow, there would be hearings and legal challenges and questions. She wasn't sure she was ready to answer, but tonight she would sleep in the house her family had built, surrounded by the evidence of their stolen dreams and the promise of justice finally served. The real battle was about to begin, but for the first time since her parents died, Lila felt like she was exactly where she belonged, at the center of a story that was bigger than her own grief, fighting for something that mattered more than her own comfort. The county courthouse had never seen a crowd like the one that gathered. On Thursday morning, Judge Morrison's courtroom was packed with reporters, family members, historians, civil rights activists, and what appeared to be every lawyer within 100 miles who specialized in property law. Outside, protesters held signs reading, "Justice delayed is not justice denied," while counter-protesters demanded respect property rights and stop the land grab. Lila sat at the plaintiff's table between Sarah Chen and Dorothy, wearing the navy blue dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her choose. Butter lay at her feet, his breathing steady thanks to his new medication. Across the aisle, Marcus Caldwell, was surrounded by a team of attorneys who had been working around the clock to challenge the validity of Essie's documentation. Judge Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, called the hearing to order. This court will determine the validity of certain property claims and the legal standing of the minor plaintiff, Lila Caldwell. I want to make it clear from the outset that this hearing will be conducted with dignity and respect for all parties involved. Sarah stood to present their opening statement. Your Honor, what we have before us today is not just a property dispute. It's the culmination of 70 years of patient documentation and legal preparation by a woman who refused to accept injustice as permanent. Essie Caldwell spent her entire adult life building an airtight case for the return of property that was stolen from her family through fraudulent means. She approached the evidence table, which was covered with maps, documents, and photographs. The evidence will show that in 1953, the Caldwell family lost nearly 3,000 acres of property and multiple businesses through what appeared to be legitimate tax sales. However, our investigation has revealed that these tax liens were fabricated. The legal proceedings were conducted without proper notice to the defendants, and the sales were orchestrated by a conspiracy of local officials and business leaders who wanted to acquire valuable property at a fraction of its worth. Marcus's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Gregory Walsh, objected, Your Honor, even if we accept these allegations as true, which we do not, the statute of limitations on such claims expired decades ago. You cannot simply ignore 70 years of settled property law because you've discovered some irregularities in historical documents. That might be true, Sarah replied calmly, if not for one crucial fact. The property never actually left Caldwell family ownership. Through a series of legal trusts and transfers that were recorded in multiple jurisdictions, Essie Caldwell maintained technical ownership of the disputed properties while allowing them to appear abandoned. The statute of limitations never began to run because the rightful owner never relinquished her claim. Judge Morrison examined the trust documents that Sarah had submitted. These are complex legal instruments. How do we verify their authenticity and validity? By calling our first witness, Sarah said. Dorothy Mills, who served as Mrs. Caldwell's legal representative for 70 years. Dorothy took the witness stand with the dignity of someone who had been preparing for this moment for decades. Under Sarah's questioning, she methodically explained how Essie had maintained legal ownership of the properties while living in apparent poverty. Essie never gave up, Dorothy testified. She knew that someday, when the time was right, her family would come home. She asked me to preserve the evidence, maintain the properties, and wait for her great-granddaughter to arrive. And how did you know that Lila was the right heir? Sarah asked. Dorothy smiled at Lila from the witness stand, because Essie described her perfectly, years before she was born. She said the child would come with an old dog, would recognize the house immediately, and would have the courage to see justice done, no matter how many people tried to stop her. Gregory Walsh's cross-examination was aggressive, but ineffective. Dorothy had been preparing for these questions for decades, and her answers were precise and unshakable. When he tried to suggest that she had manipulated a grieving child for financial gain, Dorothy's response was sharp. Young man, I'm 83 years old. I've spent 70 years of my life maintaining someone else's dream of justice. Do you really think I did that for money? The next witness was Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a historian from the State University who had been researching land rights violations in the region. Her testimony provided academic context for what had happened to the Caldwell family. What we see in the 1950s throughout the Southeast is a systematic pattern of property theft targeting successful black families, Dr. Warren explained. The methods were remarkably consistent: fraudulent tax liens, manipulated court proceedings, and forced sales to predetermined buyers. The Caldwell case is textbook, except for one thing. The family had the foresight to preserve the evidence. When it came time for Lila to testify, Judge Morrison's expression softened slightly. "Young lady, I know this is intimidating, but I need you to tell me in your own words why you believe this property belongs to you." Lila stood up slowly, her hand instinctively moving to her pocket where the rusty key rested. "Your Honor, when my great-grandmother died, she left me 3 things: a sick dog, a rusty key, and a note that told me to go to the house and trust my feet. I didn't understand what she meant until I walked into that house and felt like I was coming home for the first time in my life." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I've been in foster care since my parents died, and I've lived in a lot of houses, but none of them ever felt like home. The Caldwell house felt like home before. I even knew it was mine. Butter felt it too. That's why his health got better when we got there." "And what do you want to do with this inheritance?" Judge Morrison asked gently. It was then that Sarah approached with a document that had been sealed until this moment, a letter marked "to be read only if Lila chooses to proceed." "Your Honor," Sarah said, "Essie Caldwell left specific instructions about what should happen if her great-granddaughter decided to claim her inheritance. With the court's permission, I'd like to read her final letter." Judge Morrison nodded, and Sarah opened the sealed envelope with careful hands. The letter was written in Essie's familiar script, but the handwriting was shakier, clearly written near the end of her life. "My dearest Lila," Sarah read aloud, "if you are hearing these words, it means you have chosen to claim what is rightfully yours. I'm proud of your courage, but I want you to understand that with this inheritance comes a responsibility that is larger than our family alone." The courtroom had grown completely silent as Sarah continued reading. "The money and property I'm leaving you is not just compensation for what was stolen from us. It is seed money for a larger fight, to ensure that what happened to our family can never happen to anyone else again. I want you to use this inheritance to establish a foundation that will help other families reclaim their stolen legacies. I want you to make our story part of a larger story of justice finally served." Sarah looked up at Lila. "The letter goes on to outline specific plans for legal challenges, support for other displaced families, and educational programs about property rights. But it ends with a choice, Lila. Your great-grandmother gives you complete freedom to use this inheritance however you see fit. The question is, what do you want to do?" Lila looked around the courtroom at all the faces watching her, some sympathetic, some skeptical, some openly hostile. She thought about her parents, about the foster homes where she had never belonged, about the house that had welcomed her home. She thought about other children who might be out there, separated from their family legacy by lies and theft. "I want to do what great-grandmama Essie planned," she said clearly. "I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else." The courtroom erupted in whispers and movement, but Judge Morrison called for order. "The court will recess for deliberation. I'll render my decision tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Dorothy leaned over to Lila. "You did exactly what she hoped you would do," she whispered. "Essie would be so proud." But as they walked toward the courthouse doors, Lila could see through the windows that the crowd outside had grown larger and more agitated. The decision she had just made would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone who had been benefiting from the injustices of the past. Tomorrow, Judge Morrison would decide whether justice could indeed be served, even 70 years late. But tonight, Lila knew she had honored her great-grandmother's trust, regardless of what the court decided. The courthouse steps were crowded again Friday morning, but the mood felt different, more expectant, more solemn. Word had spread overnight that Judge Morrison was expected to render a decision that would affect far more than one family's property dispute. Representatives from civil rights organizations had arrived from Atlanta and Washington. Documentary filmmakers were setting up cameras. Even some of the business owners whose property might be affected by the decision had come to hear their fate. Lila walked into the courtroom, holding Mrs. Patterson's hand, with Dorothy and Sarah flanking them, like protective guardians. Butter padded beside them, his improvement so marked that several people commented on how healthy he looked. The new heart medication had given him energy and alertness that reminded everyone why Essie had trusted him to guide Lila home. Judge Morrison entered precisely at 9 o'clock, her expression giving nothing away. The gavel in her hand seemed to carry the weight of 70 years of waiting as she called the court to order. "I have spent considerable time reviewing the evidence presented in this case," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "What we have before us is not simply a property dispute, but a question of whether our legal system can acknowledge and correct historical injustices, even when those injustices occurred decades ago." She paused, looking directly at Lila. "The court finds that the evidence presented by the plaintiff is both authentic and compelling. The documentation provided by Mrs. Essie Caldwell represents one of the most thorough and carefully preserved cases of systematic property theft that this court has ever encountered." A murmur ran through the courtroom, but Judge Morrison continued. "The trust arrangements established by Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell in the 1950s were legal, properly recorded, and effective in maintaining family ownership of the disputed properties. Despite the fraudulent tax sales that occurred." Gregory Walsh started to object, but Judge Morrison held up a hand. "Furthermore, the court finds that the statute of limitations arguments presented by the defendants are invalid because the rightful owners never abandoned their claims. Mrs. Caldwell's 70-year effort to document and preserve evidence demonstrates continuous assertion of ownership rights." She lifted her gavel, and the courtroom held its breath. "Therefore, this court rules that Lila Caldwell is the rightful heir to the properties, assets, and legacy left to her by her great-grandmother, Essie Caldwell. All claims by other parties are dismissed." The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo through history itself. The courtroom erupted in cheers from some quarters and shocked silence from others. Lila felt tears streaming down her face, not from sadness, but from a release of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "However," she continued, raising her voice over the commotion, "this court also recognizes that the implications of this decision extend far beyond one family's inheritance. The evidence presented here suggests systematic violations of civil rights and property law that may have affected numerous families throughout this region." She looked out over the crowded courtroom. "Therefore, I am recommending that the State Attorney General conduct a full investigation into similar cases, and I am ordering that all relevant documents be preserved and made available to federal investigators." As the immediate legal victory settled over the room, Marcus Caldwell approached Lila with an expression of resignation mixed with something that might have been respect. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I thought you were being manipulated. But I can see now that you understand exactly what you've inherited and what you plan to do with it." Lila looked at him with the wisdom that seemed to come naturally to children who had grown up too fast. "You can still be part of it," she said, simply. Great-grandmama Essie's plan wasn't about keeping family out. It was about making sure family could come home. Later that afternoon, they gathered in the restored parlor of the Caldwell house for what Dorothy called a planning session, but felt more like a homecoming celebration. The documents from the safety deposit box were spread across Samuel's desk, but now they looked less like evidence and more like blueprints for the future. "The foundation will need a board of directors," Sarah explained, reviewing Essie's detailed plans. "Your great-grandmother suggested local historians, civil rights attorneys, and community leaders who understand both the legal and social implications of what we're trying to accomplish. And we'll need to decide which properties to keep and which to sell," Dorothy added. Some of the downtown buildings would be worth more as investments, but others might be better used as community resources. Lila was sitting on the floor beside Butter, who was showing more energy than he had displayed in months. The successful resolution of the legal case seemed to have lifted a weight from him as well, and he was playing with a rope toy that Dorothy had brought him. "I want to keep the house," Lila said definitively, "and I want to turn part of it into a place where families can come to research their own property histories. Like a library, but for land rights." Mrs. Patterson smiled at the maturity in Lila's voice. "What about the rest of the property?" "Great-grandmama Essie's letter mentioned helping other families," Lila said, pulling the final letter from her pocket. "I want to use the money to hire lawyers who can help people find out if their families lost land the same way ours did." Dorothy's eyes grew misty. That's exactly what she hoped you would say. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, more people arrived at the house. Not protesters or competitors this time, but community members who wanted to share their own family stories. Mr. Coleman brought his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Washington, whose grandfather had owned the sawmill before it was sold for taxes in 1954. A young teacher named David Mills, Dorothy's grandson, arrived with documents showing that his family had once owned a farm that became part of the state highway system under suspicious circumstances. "It's starting," Dorothy observed, watching as people shared stories that had been kept quiet for decades. "The healing your great-grandmother always said would come when the truth finally had space to breathe." As the sun set over the countryside that had once again become Caldwell land, Lila stood on the front porch where Essie and Samuel had posed for their wedding photograph 70 years earlier. The rusty key was still in her pocket, but she understood, now that it had never really been about unlocking doors. It had been about unlocking the courage to claim what was rightfully hers and use it to help others do the same. Butter came to sit beside her, his tail wagging as he looked out over the land that his lifelong companion had fought so hard to reclaim. In his canine way, he seemed to understand that the long journey was finally complete and the real work of justice could now begin. Inside the house, lights blazed in windows that would never be dark again, and the sound of voices planning for the future-filled rooms that had been silent for too long. The Caldwell family had come home, not just to reclaim what was theirs, but to ensure that home was a possibility for every family that had been displaced by injustice. The gavel that had fallen in Judge Morrison's courtroom that morning had done more than validate one child's inheritance. It had opened a door to a future where patience, courage, and careful planning could indeed overcome even the most entrenched injustices, one family at a time. 6 months later, the Caldwell house hosted its first official Foundation Day celebration. The front yard that had once been overgrown with neglect now bloomed with carefully tended gardens, and a discreet bronze plaque beside the front door identified the property as the headquarters of the Caldwell Family Foundation for Land Rights and Historical Justice. The transformation had been remarkable but gradual. Working with architects who specialized in historical preservation, they had converted the eastern wing of the house into research facilities and meeting rooms while maintaining the family living spaces in the western section. Samuel's old study had become a resource center where families could access databases, legal assistance, and historical research support. The parlor where Lila had first discovered the family photographs now served as a welcoming space where people could share their stories and connect with others who had similar experiences. Lila had grown in ways that went beyond her 9 years. She moved through the house with the confidence of someone who belonged there completely, but also with the wisdom of understanding that belonging came with responsibility. She had learned to balance school with foundation meetings, homework with interviews with journalists who were still fascinated by her story, and the normal concerns of childhood with the weighty decisions of managing a multi-million-dollar foundation. Mrs. Patterson had officially become Lila's adoptive mother in a simple ceremony at the courthouse where Judge Morrison had rendered her historic decision. The adoption papers were carefully preserved in the family Bible alongside the original land grants and Essie's letters, another link in the chain of legal documents that told the Caldwell family story. Mrs. Patterson had moved into the house, permanently, bringing her foster care license with her so that the Caldwell home could continue to provide sanctuary for children who needed a safe place to heal. Dorothy had accepted the position of foundation director with the energy of someone decades younger. Her office occupied what had once been a guest bedroom, and the walls were covered with maps showing successful land restorations across 3 states. In just 6 months, the foundation had helped 17 families reclaim property that had been fraudulently taken, and the database of documented cases was growing weekly. The ripple effect is exactly what Essie predicted, Dorothy told the gathered crowd from the front porch steps. Every family that reclaims their heritage gives courage to others to investigate their own history. Every successful case provides legal precedent for the next one. The celebration drew people from across the region and beyond. Dr. Elizabeth Warren had brought a team of graduate students who were documenting similar land theft patterns in other states. Sarah Chen had invited colleagues from civil rights organizations who were using the Caldwell case as a model for federal legislation. Even Marcus Caldwell had come, bringing his teenage daughter and a box of family photographs that he wanted to contribute to the foundation's archives. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in Butter himself. The combination of excellent veterinary care, a stable home environment, and what could only be described as a sense of accomplished purpose had given the elderly dog a new lease on life. He moved through the house and grounds with the dignity of an elder statesman, greeting visitors with gentle enthusiasm and serving as an unofficial therapy dog for the children who sometimes came to the house with their families. "He's like a living bridge between the past and present," observed Dr. Martinez, the veterinarian who had first treated him. "I've never seen an animal respond so positively to environmental stability. It's as if he needed to complete his mission before he could truly rest." As the afternoon celebration continued, Lila found herself in quiet conversation with a 10-year-old girl named Maria Santos, whose family had just discovered that their ancestors had owned significant property in Texas before losing it under circumstances remarkably similar to what had happened to the Caldwells. "Are you scared?" Maria asked, watching the crowds of adults discussing legal strategies and research methodologies. "About having all this responsibility?" Lila considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but then I remember that I'm not doing this alone. Great-grandmama Essie spent 70 years preparing for this, and she made sure I would have help from people who know what they're doing." She gestured toward Dorothy, who was deep in conversation with a historian from Alabama, and Sarah, who was reviewing documents with a family from Mississippi. "And I remember that this isn't really about me. It's about making sure other kids like us can find their way home too." As the sun began to set over the countryside that had been restored to Caldwell ownership, the formal part of the celebration moved indoors. In the parlor where this journey had begun, Lila stood before a small group of Foundation board members and special guests to sign the official charter that would govern their work going forward. The document itself was a work of art, calligraphed on parchment and bound in leather that matched the family Bible. Its language was both legal and inspirational, outlining not just the Foundation's mission, but its commitment to ensuring that justice delayed would never again become justice denied. "The Caldwell Family Foundation," Lila read aloud from the Charter's preamble, "exists to assist families in reclaiming stolen legacies, to document historical injustices that have been deliberately obscured, and to ensure that future generations inherit not just property, but the promise that their rights will be protected and their stories will be heard." She signed her name with the same careful attention to penmanship that she had learned from watching Essie's letters, then looked up at the gathering with a smile that held both satisfaction and determination. Dorothy was the next to sign, followed by Sarah, Mrs. Patterson, and the other board members. But when the ceremony was complete and the charter was placed in its protective case, Lila noticed that one signature was missing, the one that mattered most. From the family Bible, she carefully withdrew one of Essie's letters, the final one that had been marked for the charter signing. With reverent hands, she opened the envelope and found not just a letter, but a signature page that Essie had prepared years earlier, anticipating this exact moment. "To my beloved great-granddaughter," Lila read aloud, "if you are reading this, it means you have chosen to carry our family's mission forward. I sign this charter from beyond, with pride in your courage and hope for the future you will create. Love always, Essie Caldwell, founder and dreamer." The signature below was written in Essie's careful script, dated simply, "For the day Lila comes home." As they carefully attached Essie's signature to the charter, completing the legal and spiritual foundation of their work, Lila felt the weight of inherited responsibility transform into something lighter, but no less significant: the joy of purpose fulfilled and the promise of justice served. Outside, the last guests were departing, their cars winding down the driveway toward lives that had been changed by witnessing what patient determination could accomplish. Inside the house, lights glowed warmly in windows that would never be dark again, and the sound of family conversation filled rooms that had waited 70 years to hear such sounds. Butter settled onto his bed in the parlor with a contented sigh, his watchful eyes reflecting the satisfaction of a duty completed and a promise kept. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed across the countryside, the same railroad that Samuel Caldwell had once owned shares in, the same tracks that had brought prosperity to the region before that prosperity was stolen. But tonight, the whistle sounded like welcome rather than departure, like the promise of journeys yet to come, rather than mourning for those that had ended too soon. In the Caldwell house, the circle of justice had finally closed, and a new chapter of hope was beginning to unfold. The rusty key that had started this journey rested now in a place of honor on the mantelpiece, no longer needed to unlock doors, but preserved as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful inheritances come in the humblest forms. And in the glow of the evening light, it seemed to promise that every ending indeed was also a beginning.